So please join me in welcoming Madame Katharina with a big clap for her, please.
Ministers, Excellencies, thank you very much for this invitation today to share some thoughts about financing of sustainability and resilience. GIB is a non-profit foundation based in Switzerland, and we have been working on the topic of sustainable and resilient infrastructure for the past 8 years. We started to do that by organizing summits where we introduced about 180 projects to private investors. We had kind of a matchmaking platform. And while I was listening to the other presentations and considering the time limitations, I might skip over a few slides as the numbers for the demand have been mentioned already, and I think they're very obvious. To start, I think it's worth mentioning that one problem of gaining attraction to sustainable and resilient finance is the lack of a unique definition. I'm in a steering board of a working group financed by the Rockefeller Foundation on resilience measurement and evaluation. It's a learning group which exchanges ideas on resilience measurement. And just to give you an example, in one of those meetings, there were 14 people in the room, 14 institutions, and pretty much 14 definitions of resilience. They had a core understanding of what they were thinking they were talking about, or me too, but there is always a slight difference in understanding. So I think it's really important to come up with an alignment of this understanding to attract finance. Because resilience doesn't only involve physical, but also qualitative components, and they are hard to measure. And the data on resilience and climate change adaptation is limited, as we have, the data is limited. So it needs really a comprehensive and efficient framework. The numbers have been mentioned. There's a huge demand. And as you can see, also those numbers differ a bit because different actors refer to a little bit different definitions of things. There's a global need for investments, for infrastructure in general, but also specific requirements for climate change adaptation. You've heard the numbers. I always still like to cite the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance report, the State of City Climate Finance report, as it was published actually in 2014, but it has been changed again later on, which says that there's an additional investment need for a low emission and climate resilient path of 0.4 to 1.1 trillion. So that's what we're aiming at. At the same time, there's a bit of a stagnation in infrastructure investment. You can see this graph here. It shows the transport sector of selected countries, that infrastructure investment has not been increasing, but rather stagnating or even falling over time. Again, out of this State of City Climate Finance report, there was also an analysis of, I think, 8 development banks and the state of finance, but that was done in 2014. So as has been mentioned already, there is a lot of finance going to transport and telecom and energy, but other sectors are lacking. These development banks had been analyzed by then, but there has been definitely an increase of financing opportunities since this report in 2014. So we have a certain demand, we have a certain investment level, which makes an investment gap. Also here the numbers are they are more aligned than the numbers before. If you add, or if you would combine that with the USD $2 trillion US dollars for developing countries to achieve the SDGs, that would be a bit of a broader approach to things. Or if you would go for a number from UNCTAD, which is stating 2.5 trillion for basic infrastructure, that would be the gap there. So what are drivers of infrastructure demand? We've heard that too. The obvious ones are population growth, urbanization, increased mobility. But then there are also resilience-specific ones, disaster prevention, adaptation to climate change. And then there's this huge question of how to provide cross-benefits between sustainable development and the resilience aspects. And we think at GIB, and I will talk about that later, we have defined over 3 years a standard for sustainable and resilient infrastructure, where we try to bring those questions together. We've done this with a big stakeholder engagement with, from the UN side, there was UNOPS and UN Habitat involved, but also the World Bank and the engineering associations, city representatives, financing institutions. So we try to develop a standard that combines these questions. So when I talk about supplier finance now, coming from our history, I talk a bit more about the private side. As doing this work with the matchmaking over the last, did for 5 years, there was a need of investors, or there's obstacles obviously that sustainability and resilience benefits are not always defined in monetary but rather qualitative terms. So there's a need for definition there. And the reduction of climate risk involves a long-term investment horizon that was mentioned before. And we think there is a need for comprehensive and efficient measurement tools to make these risks and benefits transparent. This is a very interesting slide from your UNCTAD, which, now I have to find the description, shows a bit the potential of private sector contribution to the investment gap. So the dark green points show the current private sector investment in the corresponding sector. The light green points and ranges show estimated potential of what private sector investment in the corresponding sector could be. And in the sectors where the light and the green points, the light and the dark green points and ranges are higher, the difference is higher, the creation of business cases and thus private sector involvement is easier. I thought that is a very interesting way to look at things. So if you see the upper two ones, there's a wider range between the dark green and the light green part. So that might be the sectors where private investment could be raised more easily. But then if you go down to the climate change adaptation part, that distance is very, very small. So there have to be other future incentives or a lot of concentration on bringing more incentives to the private sector to invest in that sector. So why should sustainability and resilience be integrated into infrastructure design and planning? They are particularly effective due to the long-term, asset-heavy, localized, and relatively illiquid nature of infrastructure, and sustainability and resilience de-risk infrastructure projects. So this is the language we use when we talk to private investors. It's our assumption for the moment. It's not only our assumption. There are others working with that assumption. The data is lacking to prove that. So one of the work we're doing is also to create data or project registries to actually be able to really have the facts on this assumption in the future, but I think that for the moment it's not there. The other thing is that sustainability and resilience lowers default risk. We have been cooperating with a credit rating agency in China, which has integrated our Sure Standard criteria into their innovative methodology on credit rating. So I think there's a huge potential which hasn't been mentioned so far, or an actor that has to be included in that discussion are the credit rating agencies. On the other side, we work with an insurer in South Africa to also integrate our Sure Standard criteria to the insurance sector to lower the insurance premium through ESG risk reduction. And due to the risk de-risking, sustainability and resilience increase infrastructure projects' cash flows. As sustainability and resilience de-risk and improve financial performance of infrastructure, they can contribute to unlock capital needed to fill that investment gap. So this is now the Sure Standard I've been talking about. As I said, it combines a lot of frameworks. I will show that later. And it took 3 years with all these actors to identify these criteria. And the interesting thing, I think, in this context is that we incorporated adaptation resilience criteria with mitigation aspects and the SDGs into one set of criteria. That's also why there are so many of them. It's 3 dimensions and 14 themes. It's a very wholesome approach. And it also helps then to, first of all, communicate the high-risk areas of a project, but at the same time also the benefit areas of a project to investors at one glance. And the project can answer to a lot of frameworks, existing frameworks and other standards, and the SDGs. So you can see all these frameworks have been integrated into the standard. So there is the Sender framework for disaster and risk reduction, the Convention on Biological Diversity, Rotterdam Convention. On the social side, it's the ILO, it's the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So if a project is certified under that standard, it can answer to these conventions and with one certification. And it answers also to governance issues. And I think we have to think that in one, in a wholesome approach, and really try to align different indicator sets to have one common language to talk about these problems, to also be able then to create data that is convincing for private investment. Here again, a bit more in pictures, what I said before. The project is in the middle with the certification, and we're doing this with a big investment bank, Natixis, French investment bank, the development of that standard, and the project could then create a higher return through the certification, get better interest rates for credit rating, and a better premium for insurance. So that's a bit the idea of making the project even more bankable, because it can answer to a lot of questions. So from my perspective, a conclusion is that sustainability and resilience frameworks and measurement tools are needed to show the sustainability and resilience performance of an infrastructure project and indicate the benefits that can be achieved, integrating sustainability and resilience into infrastructure planning and design. So the standard is applied in the design phase. And they highlight the room for improvement, optimizing sustainability and resilience, lower default risk and damage risk. And this implies lower borrowing rates and insurance premium, and hence increase cities and investors' financial scope. So I hope this helped a bit in drawing an relation to the private sector involvement in this whole question. And I just tried to shorten a bit, and I hope I was successful in doing that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. And I think she's tried to show us the demand side, who are the drivers, the supply side, and concluded very well.